Minnesota Governor Tim Walz seemingly criticized his own party over the weekend. The former VP candidate made an appearance on CNN, was asked a question about the Democrats' election losses back in November. Take a listen.
What do you make of the criticism that one of the reasons why your party was so resoundingly rejected last November is because Democrats were gaslighting the country, saying that inflation was not a big deal, heralding Bidenomics. Not only Biden, but Kamala Harris was heralding Bidenomics, pretending that there wasn't a problem at the border.
I think one of the things that we didn't do is we assumed that we said, and it was true, that we were going to have a soft landing and our economy was better than the rest of the world. Better for who? I go back to this. Don't talk about food insecurity or housing type of issues. Talk about people being hungry and wondering where they're going to live, or about their children's future, about real security. And so I think your question is spot on. I think we got intellectualized on this.
Walz seemed to be arguing that the Democrats' message was too highbrow or possibly too abstract, I guess, to connect with voters. I mean, I think that's part of it, but I don't know if that's the main issue. I mean, the issue was just that people didn't like the state of the economy, and they thought Democratic policies were not going to do enough to address that. I don't think Kamala Harris being complicit, clearly, in Joe Biden's economic policies as his number two, was the big problem, and then she failed to explain what she would have done differently or how it would be different when prompted to do so. There was no, well, I disagree, I respect the president, but he got this one really wrong, and here's what we would do differently. And in fact, if you're trying to look back to the past on how she did differ from Biden when she herself ran for president, it was by being, I would say, more progressive on issues like, for instance, fracking and other things that were not going to, that if implemented would be, in my view, probably a lot of Americans, certainly all conservatives, we're going to be even worse for the country in terms of the economic picture. So it wasn't about being, sometimes Democrats, I think, get overly hung up on, we didn't dumb it down enough for the American people. That's just kind of like insulting. I don't think that's the problem. Furthermore, I am not at all convinced, and it might just be because I don't like him, so take that with a grain of salt, that Tim Walz is some effective communicator or appealing political candidate for the national stage, but maybe you feel differently.
Well, I do feel differently. I was glad when Kamala Harris picked him as her vice president, and I thought that he was effective, and then ended up being kind of constrained and somewhat hidden away during the campaign, and I didn't think that was useful. To your point about the election itself, I agree with a fair amount of that, in the sense of your hypothesis or diagnosis of what's happened, is, I think, underscoring the fact that it wasn't, as an election, it wasn't that exceptional, really. People see it as exceptional because it's Trump and he gets elected to a non-consecutive second term. But what you had was a vice president running to succeed an unpopular president who had been afflicted, politically speaking, by the wounds caused by high inflation in particular earlier on in his term. And therefore, Kamala Harris was always fighting an uphill battle. And if that is the case, particularly on the economy, you're always going to be struggling in peacetime elections. Now, as to Walz's point about the language used, I am more generous toward that, or more supportive of what he's saying, I think, than you are, because I do think there is a propensity sometimes for Democrats to speak in the language of academia, or the language of excessive sort of political correctness, if you want to use those terms. James Carville, who we've had on Rising and has been on most shows and most places, talks about this a lot, the idea that it is a usage of certain language like people of color or Latinx that in fact alienates people to some extent, and isn't the way even those groups refer to themselves. And so it's easy then to be cast as sort of in the ivory tower.
Well, certainly. I think it is right for Democrats to learn that lesson. I think they are learning that lesson, that, the real PC language excesses are not helpful to the party for exactly the reasons you're describing. They're alienating to working people. They're alienating to minority groups, don't even like being talked to that way. But the underlying policy matters too. That he was getting into housing insecurity. Sure, yeah, right. Why call it housing insecurity? Just call it not having a place to live, or not being able to. But Kamala Harris's plan for that was some massive subsidy to first-time home buyers, right? She was gonna give money to first-time home buyers. What was that going to? That was going to just raise that was just going to raise housing price. The market will adjust, sellers will charge more to people to buy homes. The problem is the housing supply. We have a housing supply issue, I would argue, because in a lot of cities like DC or places in California, there's too much zoning restrictions around. I think this is an area where right and left can agree that there's too much. It's too difficult to build. The tariffs are going to be bad for this because we need to buy. We need to get raw materials to build more houses. But also, just where you can build is too limited by government policy. Talk about things like that. That's along the lines of what Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are talking about in their new book. She had a throw money at it answer that I don't think would have helped anything.
Well, I think that setting aside the specifics of the housing issue, this is probably one of the sort of fundamental areas in which though we favour in some ways similar outcomes, disagree on the way to get there. Because I think you tend to think of the removal of regulation as being something that works to enable those things. And I think that is seen as a panacea only if you don't consider the inherent inequalities of wealth and power, and if you don't really give full acknowledgement to what I would consider the avariciousness of a lot of those wealthy interests. So, for example, why has the minimum wage not increased in this country for many, many, many years, to the point where even inflation now has rendered it far less valuable than it was the last time it was set at $7.50, I believe, $7.25. That's something that I would, of course, favour lifting up, and I don't think you would.
I absolutely do not.
No.
Well, not at the national level particularly. How could you have, what you can get for your money is just so different depending on what state you're in or if you're in a city. I don't see how you could have one universal rate. Because
the universal rate then is the floor. It is not saying that, if the local authorities in New York wish to have a higher minimum wage, which they do, than the federal minimum wage, then of course they should have the right to do that. But you establish a floor beyond which people do not fall, because it becomes basically rapacious to employ people at such dirt poor wages.
Yeah, that's where we just philosophically disagree. I would use some other welfare mechanism to give money to people who are in poverty. I would not say that it is illegal to work for. My basic ideology is nothing that adults, like transactions between adults that they consent to, can be invalid. If you say, I'm willing to pay you this much money to do this job, and you say you accept that arrangement, then it is no business of mine or the government. So it's just a philosophical issue. So I would not. Now, if people don't have enough money to live on, I would address that through universal basic income or more generous welfare or food stamps or something. I wouldn't say that the transaction between us is invalid. That's like I consent, I don't. I don't see why the ethics of it are any different.
Yeah, where we disagree.
But that's a philosophical issue.
Yeah, exactly. There's a philosophical difference, because I think that the scenario you just outlined ignores the fact that people can be in such straitened, desperate circumstances that they are left with no alternative but to consent to things that are obviously abusive, because they literally have no other option barring, starvation or outright penury.
Next up on Rising, rabble-rousers or rising stars, coming up, we will look at Democratic members turning to maybe new leadership. Cory Booker, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We'll discuss. Stay with us.